1 to 3 will be expected to wear masks. Let's now have this conversation with Dr. Saidu Sire. He is currently a senior education specialist at the UNESCO Regional Office for Eastern Africa, Nairobi, covering 13 countries of Eastern Africa since 2018. Prior to this posting to Eastern Africa, he was in the same capacity at the UNESCO Regional Office for West Africa, Abuja, Nigeria, for about 6 years. Dr. Saidu, many thanks for joining us here on Bottomline Africa. The limbo on how and when to reopen schools across the world, but especially in Africa, has been quite a difficult one. But we've had UNICEF and UN organizations saying it is time to reopen schools. Where do you stand in this conversation?
Thank you very much for having me. The issue of reopening of schools, UNESCO, just like the other UN agencies, are keen to have children back to the schools. But the condition would be to ensure that the reopening is safe reopening for the children as well as for the teachers and non-teaching personnel. So the circumstances in countries within this region, Eastern Africa, for example, which we cover here, are different. But I can say that a lot of them have identified dates to do that. But we agree with UNICEF and the other UN agencies and the other agencies that are supporting the reopening of schools to have children there. However, I think to be very realistic, it would depend on the governments and the context of the countries. But they would need to abide by the Ministry of Health guidance, WHO, the Ministry of Health guidance, as well as the Ministry of Education protocols. For example, in Kenya here, where we are situated, in addition to the WHO, the Ministry of Health guidance, there also exist protocols for reopening, for the safe reopening of schools. And I think that has to be abided by to ensure that the reopening is safe. Otherwise, we may end up closing again as soon as we open.
All right, but I mean, the conversation has been the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, only a quarter of schools have basic hygiene services, while less than a half have only basic sanitation. And so the conversation has been, in primary schools, which are likely to have an influx of students, how can we guarantee the safety of the learners?
Now, that is difficult. In any case, whatever we do when we reopen, we must make sure there are masks for the students. They wear their mask. They socially distance in the classroom, and that can bring about a lot of other challenges. I'm sure you know that. But there must be social distancing, washing of hands. Some schools don't have this, but some governments, including Kenya, for example, are giving capitation grants, are giving out funds to schools to organize themselves to reopen. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that is the way the other countries are going. But they realize that there is a big challenge. The development partners like UNESCO and the other development partners in education, for example, they are aware of the challenges, of the severe challenges confronting governments when they have to reopen schools.
All right. But even as even as we have this conversation on how to reopen, how to guarantee the safety of the learners, the conversation has also shifted to when to reopen. We've had a statement there from the World Health Organization and UNICEF just the other day saying the impact of an extended education disruption extends from outside the classroom to the homes as well, where we've had issues like poor nutrition, stress, increased exposure to violence, especially domestic violence and exploitation, childhood pregnancies, which we've reported here in Kenya, quite largely. Talk to us about how important it is for schools to reopen at this time and save students and many learners from further effects outside the schools.
Okay, thank you very much once again. You are very right. These are all, apart from the learning loss, which learners are experiencing since the closure of schools, there was also all these other stresses and violence and so on. So those are some of the reasons why we want them to go back to school, where they would have they have a very high level of protection, for instance. So we want them to go, but I believe it will be counterproductive if they go, if the schools are not sufficiently ready to accept them or to open safely. I think there's a balance that the balancing act that has to be done by governments to determine when to reopen. Like I said earlier, it can be a contextual situation. Context may be different. Some countries are already opened. For example, you have Mauritius and Seychelles. They have opened already. All right. They have smaller populations. They are relatively wealthier, particularly Mauritius, for instance. So they are able to cater for the small size of population, school-going population, or the tertiary institutions that they have. Now, but for countries like Kenya, where you have larger populations of school-going as well as university students and teacher training colleges and TVET institutions, the funds required are many. It will be too much. But the balance has to be there. We want them to go to school. It is best for the children. They've lost already a lot of what they have learned or what they are supposed to learn. Now they have to catch that up. They have to catch up on that, brother. And then they are experiencing stresses, psychosocial problems, which really would affect them even when they go back to school. So those things are severe. They are serious. Pregnancies, violence, and so on. We know these are serious things. That's why we are very keen to have the children, the schools reopen and the children go back to school.
All right, and let's talk about this balance that you mentioned, because so far we've had most African countries reopen institutions of higher learning and begin with final year students. When it comes to primary and secondary schools, there's a plan to perhaps have the students learn in shifts, perhaps some going in the morning, some in the afternoon, or some going between Monday and Wednesday, and some between Wednesday and Friday. I mean, everyone is trying to see how to balance this. But let's talk about how to bring all the students back to school, because everybody's doing it in phases. So how will it look like when all of them are back to school? Do we have enough facilities, enough infrastructure to cater for all of them?
Good. That's a very good question. Certainly, for example, as you've mentioned, there are governments are taking different approaches to or strategies to opening school. Some are doing the final year exam classes. Others are double shifting. But issue of double shifting is where the school is already double shifting. The country is already double shifting its primary or secondary school levels. So therefore, there's little room to maneuver with double shifting. The phasing can be done if the room is available, but to bring all of them together, that is going to pose additional problems because if we go by the guidelines, the Ministry of Health guidelines of most of these countries, certainly for Kenya, and the education protocols for safe reopening of schools, you will realize that the masking is there, social distancing is there. If a class, we used to hold 40 students, now you have to socially distance them 6 feet apart in that classroom. It has to take less. So to bring them all back, we require substantial investments in the infrastructure, in school infrastructure, as well as other types of infrastructure. All right, that is important. We may need to engage more teachers, qualified teachers, ideally for quality education. But the training of teachers will take longer than the reopening, like next month. Some countries are planning to open 15 October, some others, some part of October, and so on. So that to build the infrastructure would take longer than those periods. So it is a very, very knotty problem that is exercising the minds of governments as well as development partners.
Right.
It's difficult to, okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, I was just going to say it will be difficult to bring all of them together. Ideally, that is the best thing to do, bring them in, all of them, but that requires a lot of capital outlays in the infrastructure.
All right, and perhaps my final question, even as you wind up with that, I mean, UNESCO has had this global education coalition, which helps with tackling learning, this is the biggest learning disruption in history. How has the coalition operated since the COVID-19 pandemic? What has the coalition achieved so far, and what can African countries learn from that operation?
Okay. Now, the Global Education Coalition, as you know, it's a group of private sector technology partners who were mobilized by UNESCO, along with UNICEF and a few other international organizations, to bring them to support the countries, ideally free of charge during the COVID period at least. So they've agreed, they have an arrangement as part of members of the Global Education Coalition of technology partners to provide support to governments during the free of charge during the COVID period. We in Nairobi mobilized part of those technology partners, including Microsoft, Huawei, which ones? There are many other institutes like the Hamdan bin University, bin Muhammad University of Smart University of Kuwait, Dubai, for example, United Arab Emirates, and many others who are working with us from providing platforms free of charge, as Microsoft is doing in Kenya. It has a platform. The Microsoft Teams platform is available to the government, free to use, both for meetings of officials, government officials, as well as use to support learning. Excuse me. Huawei, or let's say Microsoft is also supporting the Kenya Education Cloud to improve its security, for example. All right, Huawei is doing a similar thing with universities, training TVET teachers, etc., etc. These are happening, and not only in Kenya. This is just for Kenya. The same is happening in Uganda, in Rwanda, in South Sudan, and several other countries here. The partners, there are several other partners. We had mobilized them, we met with them, and what we do right now as UNESCO, as a matter of fact, following up on these Global Education Coalition technology partners, we had mobilized them regionally. Now they are working at the country level with our focal points in each country, working with the ministry to identify the solutions that they prefer. Some solutions deal with platforms, online digital learning platforms. Some deal with capacity building of the teachers to be able to use the platforms and the digital resources available. Some others are digitizing content which can be uploaded on the platforms. These are all support that is coming from the partners. Too many actually to name at the moment. We are happy with what we are doing with them and the way they are supporting countries continue learning. So that is, I think, just two of the partners and what they've done in Kenya and other parts of Eastern Africa, the East Africa region.
All right. Dr. Seydou Jallow there is an education specialist speaking to us with UNESCO. Doctor, we must wind up this conversation for purposes of time, but many thanks for being with us to speak to us about the tough balancing act governments have in balancing returning students back to school and still guaranteeing their health. That conversation will come to you later on here on KTN News. Let's take a short break here on Bottomline Africa. More news still to come on the other side. Let's now